What middle name will you acknowledge?
Hi, I'm Sheila James Kuehl. Welcome to another episode. Is this an episode? I guess it is a sort of episode.
Just
Get
a little
Used to
episode.
It, which is, as I hope you already know, a talk show concerning gay and lesbian issues. Our discussion today will be about issues that, in my opinion, are slightly larger than just the gay and lesbian community. We're going to talk about the National Endowment for the Arts, public broadcasting system, and the new contract on America, which seems to want to defund not only these entities but others. A question that we'll hopefully explore today is what's going on about this, and in terms of the fact that it seems to many of us that our community is being used as a wedge issue on all of this defunding discussion. We want to explore that as well. So we hope you'll stick with us through this whole thing. I think it's going to be a pretty interesting show. My guests today are Patrick Scott, who is the president of the National Campaign for Freedom of Expression. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you.
Robin Podolsky, who is a writer, columnist, activist, and who has a book forthcoming, as I understand it, with the provocative title Queer Cosmopolis, which I think we can look forward to next year. It is next year now, isn't it? 1996, from NYU Press. And Tim Miller, who is a performer, a performance artist, I think he used to call himself, and now even more broadly a performer, and artistic director of Highways in Santa Monica, and also I think one of the reasons that the NEA runs in great danger of being defunded. So congratulations for that.
I do
Tim.
my part.
I think you did. Well, Patrick, let me start with you. In terms of this sort of approach that we saw starting a couple of years back, really, with the NEA, and now on the front pages of all of our newspapers about the public broadcasting system, hearings being held in Washington about whether or not it's a good idea to fund the arts, to even fund the humanities. What do you think is going on here?
Well, it really began in the late 80s, around 1988, and there has been a consistent strategy in place by the right, the ridiculous right, the rigid right, the radical right, however you want to characterize them, to trivialize the arts and to demonize artists such that over time they could control a conversation about the arts that would ultimately cause Congress to withdraw federal support. And the importance of federal support, it's a very complex issue, and we'll have to weave in and out of some of those complexities in the show today, but that is accountable to the mandate of our country to represent all of the people that are living here. And so this is in a nutshell what they want to do is basically turn culture over entirely to the commercial domain and to market forces and to prevent agencies such as the NEA providing support for artists who are pushing the envelope of consciousness.
Explain a little bit, and we'll feel free to jump in. But how does public funding work? I mean, I imagine there are at least thousands, if not more, people watching the show who have a sort of a sense of the difference between commercial television and PBS, for instance. But we probably all think that it's our pledges, that keep it going because we're always seeing pledge drives. How does public funding work? Well,
there's differences in each domain. When we're talking about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the entity that presents public broadcasting, or the National Endowment for the Arts, or the National Endowment for the Humanities, or for the Institute for Museum Services. Each of these are government agencies that get allocations by Congress that have different mechanisms for distributing the money. But the NEA is particularly remarkable in its structure for the use of artists and people from arts institutions to make the decisions about how the money is spent. So when you hear the phrase the peer panel process, which has been much under attack, it means that in the domain of theater, theater directors would come together to decide what theater is most important to be funded in a given year. So what they've turned that into, even though it's one of the ultimate democratic processes, is an elitist, they're calling it a padded playpen for the elite, as though artists are giving money to artists and it's all very closed.
Well, artists have sort of always been demonized in a way. I mean,
Yes.
I think that this is an aspect, too, of when we talk about our own community's history in the arts and letters, that artists are marginalized, demonized, and at the same time called some kind of elite. It's not as though they're a power elite, although maybe that's the way, or maybe that's the problem. Why does the radical right want to do away with this kind of public art or support for artists whose work might not be supported by commercial television or a commercial stage, etc.?
The irony is really that the image, to use, because we're an image-based culture, not to diminish sound or words, but the image is tremendously powerful and immediately available. So there is power there, and the irony is that the conservatives recognize that power more immediately than have the liberals, and have jumped on to the potential to work that image situation to our own detriment. Whereas the liberal constituency has had a less immediate sense of what this equation is all about and how it works.
I've noticed that. We don't seem to be doing as well in terms of creating the
Sound
imagery.
bites.
I've said to some of my colleagues, liberals are mumbling a lot. They apologize a lot. They don't seem to have in mind what they want to say.
Yes, that I think gets to why the right has an interest to portray art as something for the elite, because actually I think that's what they want. And the actual effect of defunding organizations like the NEA is that it will simply be harder for artists who don't have inherited money or access to wealthy patrons to spend full time on their art. And actually, I think that what the conservative right is after, given the kind of economy that they're pushing, in which there is going to be no middle class, there's going to be the very rich and the very poor, is to create a situation in which people who perceive of themselves as ordinary folks, working people, won't aspire to an artistic life, and in fact art will become the province of the elite. Because I think that what these folks are after is lowering poor people's expectations of the amount of joy and fulfillment and self-expression that a working person is entitled to in life.
So let me back up a step. What's important about funding art or making airtime available to more of a variety of programming? Don't we have plenty of programming and plenty of art?
What's important is that the genius kid from East LA who's making illegal art on walls can perhaps get a chance to make a life work out of creating images that talk about what it is like to come from a working class family in East LA and try to survive. And that kind of thing makes it much harder for the right wing to demonize that working person's family, to the farmer in the Midwest, to the black person in Bedford-Stuyvesant. If all of these people begin to have access to expression through art, which humanizes and which makes people's lives apparent to each other, and including queers, then that makes it harder for people to demonize us and to blame the people who are also disempowered. Art creates vehicles for people to understand each other, and if we begin to understand each other, then we may also begin to understand the real elite, and they may begin to be in trouble.
So there's a real threat, as we've seen with any kind of knowledge. I mean, the reason, in my opinion, that the right wing is so interested in education suddenly and controlling school boards and schools is because if you control information, if you control truth, as it were, or the varieties of truth, and make it seem as though there's only one truth or one pattern or one way to live life, then in essence you have rendered invisible all other points of view. But there was something else in what you said, Robin, I want you to explore a little further. This notion of Stepfordness. I don't know if that's an image that still makes sense to people, but this, this lockstep, everybody do things the same way. You want things to be invisible You want people's real lives, our real lives, to be invisible so that it seems that there's only one way to do things. Why would the right wing want that to be the result?
Well, it's an emphasis on decorum. It's very restoration. It's very 17th century. And what that was about was the restoration of an elite. You know, it's interesting when the right wing talks about the old days and the old ways and how they're in trouble. I mean, I think they really would like to get back to a time in which, as in the Puritan colonies, it was illegal for someone who didn't make a certain amount of money to wear too nice things. I think what they're interested to recreate is a very much more rigidly stratified society in which people know their place. And that means going back to some very old American values of decent people don't expect too much out of life. You put your nose to the grindstone and you work very hard. And in fact, what they're doing to working people is they're using the best of us against ourselves, because of course one wants to be responsible. You want to take care of your parents, you want to take care of your kids, you want to earn a living. And that calls for a little bit of sacrifice. And after a while, you don't want to be in constant pain about that. Well, you begin to tell yourself, all right, a good person doesn't expect to be happy. In fact, a mature individual bases their personality on their ability to give up what they want, to sacrifice, to regard dreams to be a middle-class indulgence that decent working people don't have time for. And so all that goodness and sense of community and sense of responsibility is turned into this self-regulatory mechanism that keeps people in place. And why the artist is a threat is the artist is expressing a different kind of aspiration. The artist is saying, you know what? Working people aren't just these sturdy yeomen who go to work. We even have an aesthetic sense. We even have, on one hand, a desire for beauty, on the other hand, real awareness of pain, and a willingness to express both those things and to care to make the world different, to shape our world. And that's the most dangerous thing, is when people pull their nose away from the grindstone long enough to say, you know what, I want to reshape my whole world.
That is the danger.
Yes.
What do you think, Tim?
Well, that's where the funding has come in as well, is this tiny, and it's important to really remember, there's been a tiny amount of money. I mean, it's the oft-touted statistic that we spend less on the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, than on the Marine Corps Army Band. I mean, literally, in terms of governmental sanction, we put more value on the Marine Corps Army Band on the entire cultural life of the 50 states, which is fairly shocking. I mean, actually, it seems right in line with what the current administration and the Congress would quite like, more Army bands. But in fact, this tiny amount of money in the last 20, 25 years has created a huge cultural explosion in our society where women, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, and of course lesbians and gay men have suddenly really claimed enormous amount of venue, of voice. And suddenly these artists are telling their stories of their communities and their cultural identities. And not only are the stories being heard, they're also creating organizations that support specific cultural voice, whether that's self-help graphics in East LA, or the Museo del Barrio in the Bronx in New York, and literally hundreds and hundreds of other organizations who are have only been made possible by this tiny little amount of 69 cents a year from each citizen to the National Endowment, and then a much smaller amount that's coming from state arts councils. So it's been a tiny little amount of money, as Jane Alexander said in Congress yesterday, which is amplified probably 20-fold. It's a very good investment because it creates all kinds of jobs, other opportunities, supports businesses in local communities, because art money creates enormous other kinds of social energy.
Of course, it was funny, the commentary I've seen on her commentary was she was trying to focus her message so that people would think even this had a commercial result. So if you care so much about commerce being, the it of it and the lifeblood of America, then we're really creating jobs. I mean, the sort of the magic word. But it felt as though she was characterizing for her audience, not that it was disingenuous, but to say, we know you don't understand anything about art. Let me talk to you about at least the economy.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a strategy, but I don't think I think it's right on. Actually, at the tiny little amount of yeast that goes into cultural production and the energies that are released from a communication of arts and ideas actually does release all kinds of other intersocial events of people leaving their homes, being in relation to each other, going and eating at places and hanging out, and stopping being perhaps so fearful or isolated from each other.
The strategy has shifted from focusing on individual artworks and demonizing the artist based on those images to saying, do we really need to afford this? I mean, isn't this a luxury, and isn't this money something that could go? Jarvik, who runs a public media think tank in New York, says, well, choosing between food stamps and the arts, of course the American public would choose food stamps, as though those had any parity to be chosen one against the other. So that now we are put in a position of having to make this economic argument that in fact there are more people working in the arts than in the combined rubber and steel industries in America. And it's a good thing for people to begin to see that this is integral to our whole lives. But this is the progress of the strategy from the right to defund. They're less concerned about today, about homoerotic images, than they are about using this portraying it as a luxury that can be cut.
But I think if it reflected art that they approved of, they would rather lose food stamps, which they also, think are going to people that they demonize. Because I can't remember who said it, but somewhere in some publication, someone said, and I think it was actually a member of Congress, it was fine when art was about truth and beauty. But this art that we're seeing funded is, some, I don't know, denigration of life, some ugliness, and of course by that they mean our ugliness, among other kinds, I think. Do you think that's an aspect of it?
Well, what Robin said earlier about shifting, even though they use the term elitism to negatively characterize the world of the arts, that this threat now is bringing out the large institutions for their own survival. And so you hear the symphonies, operas, and ballets now getting into the battle in a way they never did before, when the issue seemed to be just a matter of some marginal queers.
First they took the Jews away, then they took the queers away,
exactly.
Now they're coming to my door.
Exactly. So there are a lot of Republicans on the boards of trustees of the Philharmonics and the museums, and they will go and say, don't you dare cut us. And the result will be that all funding for individuals or rural initiatives or these kind of less traditional forms of dispersing funds will go by the wayside. And in fact, the agency has already started to cut in those areas in anticipation or in response to the congressional cuts.
Well, that goes along, I think, with what Robin was saying before, in terms of, it seems there's a difference between institutional art. I mean, museums in their own way, at least many of them, are a kind of institutional art, aren't they? They choose to say that which is art.
Well, sure, and there's also, there isn't one monolithic art world, and some of the individuals whose work has been supported through grants from the NEA and other sources are people who have wound up pushing the envelope to the extent that they became museum-based artists, but only because their work was allowed to flourish at a time when they couldn't have gotten into a museum. I think it's true, the art world generates its own institutions, and then those institutions have to be confronted, and people are learning from each other and changing all the time. But I think part of what's going on does go to what you raised about, well, what is the point of art? Is it just to reflect someone's idea of truth and beauty? Because I don't know any two people who would define those things in the same way. And I did say earlier, part of what it does for people who've been denied access is validate an aspiration toward beauty on the part of people who aren't called that by the dominant culture. But I think it does more. I think it allows people to express what we regard to be painful and express what we think ought to be changed. Cornel West said this wonderful thing. He said it's really interesting that in old Greek drama, when they dealt with the lives of quote-unquote ordinary people, you see them in the comedic and the bucolic. You never see the lives of ordinary working people uplifted to the level of tragedy. Okay, because anything that's complex, that's heroic, which means ugly, which means fallible, and that stirs people's deepest feelings. That's when those people get to serve as representative of the big stuff, right? Of the cultural, classical big stuff. And the only time that people of color, women, lesbians, and gays, working people, are going to get to see our lives portrayed to that degree of complexity is when we do it.
Of course, Shakespeare did the same thing, put all the ordinary people in the comedies and all the royalty in the tragedies. There may be another message in that too, and that is that important stuff only happens to rich people or people with power. It's the same as in terms of reading history. History is about wars mostly, and about westward expansion and the building of the railroads. It's certainly not about the people who were the healers in their village or whatever.
And it's real interesting that the right wing is fighting real openly for control over that history of, are we talking about the westward expansion in terms of the displacement of indigenous people, the silencing of women, about Asian labor building the railroads, or are we going to continue to talk about manifest destiny? I mean, that's still a lot.
Well, that's the other thing when we talk about PBS too, because we've talked about art, which has inherent in it, it seems, ideas. Though it's more difficult sometimes to say, what was the idea behind that? It's often more visceral. But what about broadcasting itself in terms of words and message? One of the reasons you want to get a variety of messages out has something to do with critical thinking, doesn't it?
Well, that's where the terrain of PBS, or the attacks on Corporation for Public Broadcasting, is even more outrageous in this war we're in, which is a war over images and representation. And it's one of the few things Pat Buchanan got right at the Republican convention, that they declared this war on this kind of monolithic idea of what our culture is and whose voice is heard, really, and who gets to be the heroes and heroines of our stories, as Robin beautifully put. But I know for me, just to get anecdotal, which I think is good, I came out and understood the first crucial building block where I understood who I was as a gay 14-year-old in the San Gabriel Valley was by watching KCET and seeing a Trinity theater production of a play about Oscar Wilde called Feasting with Panthers. And suddenly there on TV, sitting in, on the deep pile shag carpeting, I'm seeing something that immediately registered as, wow, that is me. This is like, there's a history, there's a culture, there's a tragedy, because this great wrong that was done to one of our great queer writers, Oscar Wilde. And it was like 5,000 light bulbs going on in my head at that moment. And it's, I was actually I'm writing about this right now, and I was reading in my journal, which of course I was keeping at 14.
Of course.
About every experience. That's how performance artists are made. But I think actually they don't want those light bulbs to be turned on, and that's part of where this war is so crucial. And they're very canny. It's dangerous for them those light bulbs to be turned on. By keeping Marlon Riggs' extraordinary film, Tongues Untied, about the experience of African American gay men, an incredibly silenced and large population in our society, and by keeping that off of 2/3 of the markets, they kept some X number of powerful light bulbs being turned on over these queer young black men's heads all over this country. And that's an incredible and shameful victory for them, because it's going to create massive ongoing self-esteem problems, silencing, closetedness, disempowerment, all of the things which of course are right along the right-wing agenda, especially as it relates to lesbians and gay men.
So there's a relationship too. When I hear all of you talking about not just gay and lesbian artists or truths or lives or messages, but silencing along a broad spectrum, it's not often a connection that our community makes, but is it one that you make here? in terms of the silencing?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the National Campaign for Freedom of Expression is not specifically a gay and lesbian organization, but since we were founded in 1990, most of the people that call us up that are being hassled by the FBI or by a church or by a school board happen to be gay and lesbian. But our whole focus is really the spectrum of American culture that's being suppressed by any number of other counter institutions that are part of this war that's been declared. And certainly schools and education. I think part of why we're in such an intense debate is that we've had 3 generations now of people go through the schools with virtually no art education. That the systematic defunding of education has caused arts and other non-core subjects to be cut. So you see the same pattern being played out in the school, and there's of course many dedicated gay and lesbian teachers who are there to bear witness to the history that's not in the history books. Critical thinking is that factor that's under attack for very young people.
Well, it seems to me that ties in. I mean, when you were talking at the very beginning of the show about why is it that we want to keep these images off the air, identity, definitely one of them. But it also has to do with, when you said, Robin, people come out of their houses.
Tim said that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tim said that. That people come out of their houses to go to these events or to go to a performance, though we don't often have to if we're watching it, you know, on TV. Still, the notion that you will know something beyond your own life and be able to measure what people are telling you in one arena against what you are seeing and hearing, if there's a variety of it on the air, etc. That's an aspect of critical thinking and something that I would like to explore, but we're going to take a very short break. So please stick with us, and we'll be right back to Get Used to It.
Hey, faggot, come here, I want to talk to you.
Yeah, I don't want any trouble.
You got a problem, faggot?
I'm not gonna fight you.
Oh, yeah?
Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Welcome back to Get Used to It. Today we're talking about the arts and broadcasting, NEA, PBS, the relationship to the gay and lesbian community, and I have 3 wonderful guests, Patrick Scott, Robin Podolsky, and Tim Miller. And we're talking about defunding all of these wonderful enterprises and the sort of the whys of it. Tim, we talked in the first half, just to bring people up to speed if they're just tuning in, about sort of the broader picture about what the arts are for and why art and broadcasting, as the public funding anyway, might be under attack. I want to talk a little bit more now about us, about gay and lesbian people, and certainly your performances and the funding of some of your work was an aspect of an attack on the NEA early on. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Right. Well, in this general terrain we've been talking about cultural representation, equity, and and certainly for me, in my little role I played in that battle for a number of years, I've explored through my performances, as well as in starting performance spaces, nonprofit arts organizations like Highways in Santa Monica and PS 122 in New York City. But in my work itself, I've really been able to explore in a really specific way my experience as a gay man, my experiences also physically in my body, the details of my life as a sexual being, as a queer cultural being as well, and all the forces that exist. And there's something that actually, I think, freaks people out about this, partly because the culture generally is body phobic and sex phobic, but then it kind of gets a little rocket on it when it starts being attached to the queer body or lesbian and gay men's sexuality and actual corporeality as bodies. And it's part of why the photographs of the images freak people out so much. And it, of course, then becomes a real easy tool for the right wing to use these images, these performances, to try to detach, lesbian and gay cultural expression from the world as we know it, and use that as a target to then attack a whole array of cultural voices. But I think for us right now, our identity, our images, our stories are so deeply contested and fear-producing for certain terrified straight white men, a large number of them in the U.S. Congress at this point.
You're right.
When you'd see the camera pan to the right side of the House, that there's something that it's part of our power as queer people as well, too, is to engage people's freak-out potential and their terror of the other. And I think lesbians and gay men do that almost more effectively than any other community. I mean, people of color can do it as well. Women can do it, for these men who get nervous easily.
Well, I would say that lesbians might not be as threatening, but then I think about Holly and her work, and
right.
But it seemed as though we were used as the example of what terrible decisions this NEA
right.
decision-making body had made to give good tax money away to do this kind of work, or the photographic images you're talking
right.
about, or any of the cultural presentations. Why do you think we're such a wedge issue? Certainly in terms of arts funding.
Well, I love these studies that the worst thing and the most common curse word and bad thing you could be called on a playground is fag. It's like in every state of this country. It used to be girl. Girl was more my era. So in a way, like the training begins at pre-language practically, that the worst thing you can be is a queer. And when you amplify that from the playground to a larger playground of the U.S. House of Representatives, it's really just a logical continuation of that slur of demonizing certain people. And we're easy to demonize because it plays into people's fear of sex, fear of unbridled desire and eros right. and sexuality as well.
Of course, it's interesting, gay men talk about how we are about sex, and lesbians, though we are more and more in tune with being about sex, talk about gender in addition. I want to ask you, Robin, because I know you and I have had some of these discussions. The other fear why we call people faggot is to make certain that the boys will act like boys
right.
and not like girls. And to some extent, that has to do with how important it is to keep this gender separation.
Well, I think on one hand, it represents a covert acknowledgement that this separation is a lot more culturally constructed than natural. Yeah. Otherwise, why this hectic effort to keep it in place? I mean, we weren't born wearing different clothing. We weren't, It's certainly true that most of the people who are defined as women probably have the ability to reproduce. It's certainly also true that that's hardly all that we're capable of. And one parenthetical thing, though, with regard to sex, what's interesting is the right wing can't always control the effects of their own behavior, because in fact, after the NEA controversy, and it dawned on lesbians that we were regarded to be much less of a sexual threat, there was such an explosion of art dealing with lesbian sex. It was like, what do you mean? And it actually made lesbians want to examine, well, wait, why are we seen as so nice? Why are we seen as so innocuous? Wait a minute. And it made us want to bring our sexual variety and diversity and badness out into the open too, which is something the right might not have predicted. I mean, again, parenthetically, it's really interesting that some of the most popular right-wing videos, like The Gay Agenda, contain some of the most blatant representations of queer corporeality and public ecstasy and leather, SM, etc. And I just don't think that they're going to be able to control the effect of those images among their own population, because now those people are going to be able to go to bed murmuring things like, I don't know if you can say this on the air, brimming. And now they never
I
knew
think
the
you can say
word.
almost anything on this air until
now
they defund it. You know.
Well, see, now I mean they're giving people activities to associate in a vocabulary. So I mean, who knows what
You
what's
won't
gonna
keep
happen.
them on the farm now.
Of course, they were never probably on the farm. The problem is the secrecy of it, the shame of it. I mean,
Right.
they always try to ratify the shame. Well, so do we have the same thing, not in only in the artistic arena, but when we were talking about PBS, I'm thinking about Tales of the City, for instance. What a radical show, was it? But we see this also as an aspect of what's being, you know, creating such horror.
Well, I mean, virtually anyone experiences that series of books as one of the most remarkably faithful depictions of the culture in San Francisco. They recognize themselves immediately. But it presented a continuum where everybody had a place in a community, so that the gay and lesbian characters were not distorted into some high-level tragedy or minimalized. Everybody had a place. So it was a picture of, remember the early campaign rhetoric about America as it really is? That's one of the closest things in its own sweet way to America as it actually is, played out in a miniseries over the course of a week.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful thing. What's the problem?
Well, there's visibility for alternative lifestyles that clearly the rigid right does not want seen as a normal, functioning, participatory part of life as it's lived in this country.
And that brings out another important point, because on one hand, the right wing objects vociferously to manifestations of queer culture that are, in fact, defiance of normative gender roles and normative behavior. A Mapplethorpe picture which showed in no uncertain terms that a man can be penetrated. The male body is not, in fact, inviolable metaphysically. It's
And thank
physically.
God, really.
On the other hand, they also object to portrayals of lesbian and gay life which feature people who, in at least a lot of their aspects of their personal life, are pretty happy with what's called normative culture. So they don't like it when they see lesbians and gays of color, as Tim pointed out. They don't like, because that means that in fact we're not a white elite. They don't like it when they see lesbians and gays doing quote unquote normative activity, and they don't like it when they see lesbians and gays doing sexually transgressive activity. And what it comes down to is they don't want us to be in the world.
That's the same discussion that I hear when we talk about marriage, for instance. You say, well, you don't want everyone to be so incredibly promiscuous or outside. You know, why don't they have normal families like everyone else? And the answer is because you won't let them. I mean, you either have to have it one way or the other, and what the right wing has always said about us is you may not have it one way or the other. You may not exist. I mean, I think the point is well made. But is there another reason? I was thinking about, are we an easy target? Because it could be that the agenda was to do away with public funding of the arts and broadcasting entirely anyway. I often feel like we're sometimes in the crosshairs and sometimes not, as it suits their purpose. You know, we'll be demonized, then someone else will be demonized, and someone else will be demonized. All seems very cynical to me. Because there are probably very good reasons for people who want a Stepford mentality to do away with public funding altogether. I mean, people have said, why don't you guys tone it down, and then the whole arts and broadcasting complex won't be in such danger. Do you think we're an easy target for them? I mean,
Oh,
we sort
yeah.
of do
I
it to
mean-
ourselves, or?
I mean, especially within the feeble kind of crawling of this pathetic culture, oops, I said it, towards some kind of cultural equity. It has become, you know, except for Reagan, Bush, kind of the ways they could sort of be racist through commercials and stuff. Basically, you'd be less likely to have them stand up in a campaign speech and bait an audience around race in the overt way that virtually every right-leaning public official feels completely comfortable to bait people's homophobic impulses. Now, partly because lesbians and gay men are a product of this culture and also have fed into all this internalized shame and and self-esteem junk that this culture crammed down our throats through, the school system and family. And religion, let us not forget. So in a way, then, we also, in some difficult ways, participate in that oppression. So we become a really, really, really easy target that they almost never have to take flack for their attacks, or they take so little flack, it's really worth it for them.
Because with other communities, other disempowered communities, there have risen up organizations and structures to advance the agenda of people of color. Whereas most of the gay and lesbian organizations responded to the crisis of AIDS. And so they're already the agenda of those organizations is already involved in something that is equally repugnant to the American public. And so they can easily collapse and equate gayness, queerness with disease and corruption. And the organizations that are largely involved in advancing the concerns of gay and lesbian people are heavily stressed just trying to deal with the economic and medical challenge of trying to deal with a plague.
Of course, GLAAD has some role to play in this, doesn't it? I mean, I found them rather effective.
Oh, yeah.
As an anti-defamation kind of approach, and I think they've attempted to incorporate the notion of just images of our lives deserve to be aired, and just the kind of thing you were talking about, just demonizing us, we need to sort of meet. I mean, I think your point is well taken, no question.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's interesting is that there was a concerted effort to have an anti-gay initiative in California, and it was so clear that the structures and organizations exist in this state to protect the rights of gays and lesbians to the degree that it was not feasible. They would not have a victory, and they would spend countless millions of dollars trying to promote it. It's partly because of the new visibility in Hollywood of Geffen and others that have put money where their mouth is on this, that they found it not a viable thing to try to pull off in this state. So, again, as you pointed out, the attacks are causing a response that ultimately, in my belief, will serve our community very well.
And it might win us some powerful allies. It's really interesting to me that the president chose and seemed to think that it was politic to join the chorus of attack on Hollywood. And it's interesting that these folks may be pushing the industry to defend itself, and I'm not sure that they're going to find that was a really smart thing to do. I was really fascinated to see, I think it was the Lincoln Awards. What was the big award that Pete Seeger got?
The Kennedy Center Awards.
The Kennedy Center Awards.
You always were mixing up Kennedy and Lincoln, I noticed that.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I went to a public school too.
And they taught you history.
Right. But it was really interesting to me that in front of this really interesting mix of industry and Washington and liberal people, when Arlo Guthrie chose in his musical tribute to Pete Seeger to include a statement against Proposition 187, the wave of spontaneous, relieved, and joyous applause he received. It's real interesting to me that Garth Brooks, who's the quintessential, really roots, heartland American artist, chose very bravely to put a lot of effort behind a song which celebrated all kinds of diversity, racial and with regard to sexual orientation. It makes it quite clear that he loves his blood sister, who's a lesbian, and that he's not about to attack her for anyone. I think that they might learn that if they're going to attack not only what's regarded to be high art, but also entertainment and the industry and all that, these are people who are going to fight back and who are just as adept at the language of representation as they are.
Well, that's interesting to me because people who are not engaged in high art still, with some apology sometimes, consider themselves artists. Country western singers who are singing, I think, better than anyone else, just basic, bare truth of people's lives. I mean, that's what I love about country western music. Think that they are engaged in art, communication, entertainment, sure, but some kind of truth-telling about regular people's lives. And it is the case, I think, with a lot of independent filmmakers, and we have more of those now than ever since the studios have sort of broken up, that these people will be wonderful allies for us. You don't find entertainers and other artists, whether they're just sort of pop culture artists, attacking us very much. You find them slowly coming to the conclusion that we're all in some big group together, and that they're a little outraged by this, don't you think? Do you think that people who are commercial artists feel threatened by this defunding stuff, or do they see themselves as very separate?
Well, the argument hasn't really successfully been made between how this amount of money going to this small population actually impacts the whole culture. Certainly the film industry has been slow on the uptake to recognize that their talent comes from the arts in large part, and the healthier that climate is, the better it is going to be for the food chain of the entertainment industry. So, you know, I haven't really heard that argument being successfully made, but there are certainly highly visible people in the industry who have been involved in the gay and lesbian community and AIDS and those related, that nexus, that do get it, and you know, will be going to Congress during the month of February and protesting the defunding of the NEA.
Yeah. On the other hand, though, I think that if anyone's going to be raising the issue of homophobia and erotophobia, it's going to be us. It's not going to be anyone other than queers, because what we learned with the first round of this stuff, when Robert Mapplethorpe's work was very much at issue, that there were some people who thought, we can't touch this with a 10-foot anything, and what we ought to do is simply wrap ourselves in the flag, call it a censorship issue, you know, refer to freedom of speech and call it a day. And that didn't work. And in fact, we saw that the right wing has an amazing, unlimited ability to co-opt anything. And they started screaming censorship anytime anyone ever disagreed with them, denied them a venue, sought to enlarge the canon, sought to enlarge what could be put on television. They started screaming, this is politically correct censorship. And they took that terrain back. I think that at some point we're going to have to acknowledge, yeah, you know, to an extent this is an argument about values. And if we put a value on, for instance, relationships based on, yes, some degree of personal happiness and fulfillment for the people involved who don't need the excuse of procreation, if we say that that's a value, and it's not something for the middle class elite, it's something that any person ought to have in their life, that's a battle.
Well, it's been historic, hasn't it, the sort of anti-pleasure approach of any entities that wish to control large groups of people, whether they're governments or churches. I'm not exactly sure why, I suppose. Is it possible that pleasure is somehow related to critical thinking? We don't locate them in the same places in the body.
Well, they're hard to control. I mean, any impulse that sets people's ecstasy free, whether it's the brain or the genitals, is actually really threatening to a control impulse. And controlling people's bodies and sex is probably as important as controlling their hearts and their minds. And that's part of, I think, since we seem to move around those three neighborhoods as queer people with a particular ease sometimes, I think, that makes us particularly dangerous.
I'm reminded of a situation in Oregon when Channel 1, this commercial entity trying to put television into classrooms, presented a little show that had the image of Michelangelo's David in it. The parents went crazy. They didn't care that their kids were being sold Mars bars in the classroom and that television was being used as a way to get at their pocketbook. They were concerned about the image of this highly sensuous icon that has been identified as homosexual. So there you have that, that pleasure crisis.
Right. right, which is actually like 20 feet off Beach Boulevard in Orange County. So I think they grew those cypress trees high now.
Well, one thing pleasure certainly endangers is a very ruthless marketplace strategy that's based on so-called competitiveness and downsizing, which means lower your expectations at home, folks. It means it's not going to get better for anyone but the rich. And we certainly can't have you people expecting anything like pleasure.
Well, and the other thing is, of course, this is a commodity that haven't quite figured out how to control the market for.
Yeah.
One can seek one's own pleasure without having to go buy it normally, and it's quite a problem. So it's almost as though I was thinking when you were talking about Mars bars instead of Michelangelo, it's a way of channeling what you should take pleasure in.
That's right.
Pleasure in consumption. I mean, there's been an enormous drive to try to convince us that retail therapy is really the greatest pleasure. You know,
Right.
go shopping if you're upset.
And in fact, consumption that's really kind of about obliterating the body, that's about Mars bars and maybe too much to drink and sitting in one place and watching an image all day and going to an artificial environment and buying more and more things. And that's really different from pleasure that's cited in the body. That's really kind of democratic. That
I
anyone
saw
can
that
have.
two people were married in virtual reality. Did you see? I don't know.
I heard about that.
Channel surfing, you know, and saw this where they actually had the kiss after the ceremony, but they were about 30 feet apart. Now there's the ultimate, right?
Really?
You could, why you could have this experience and never even be in the same town. Well, what do you think's going to happen? I mean, here we are. We're now in the middle of a struggle on this. Are we going to lose?
Well, after you're president, I think it'll be fine, Sheila.
Thank you, Tim. Vote for me, I'll set you free. That's what everybody said should be our slogan.
Yeah,
really.
absolutely.
I think it'll get really ugly. It's been ugly for some time, but I think you know, obviously it's going to get hotter again. I think ultimately we're in an inexorable move towards more images, more cultural voices. I don't think you can shut people up unless you start piling them in mass graves, at least considering the cultural tradition we're in, at least as I see it right now. And I like to think this is the last gasp of the monoculture that is really trying to say this country is only for, you know, straight white Protestant men, which isn't what my public school in Los Angeles County was like, you know, 30 years ago.
And didn't really teach us that either.
Right.
Tried to.
Right.
But there would always be the teacher that would feel so embarrassed that that was the narrow message, that she or he would say, you know, but on the other hand, and then tell something personal.
Right, right.
So maybe they won't win. But if they win on the defunding issue, I mean, it is a blow, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's a huge silencing. I mean, it means artists will not have money to create films, videos, performances. Organizations will fold. It'd be a lie for me to say if the National Endowment for the Arts is defunded that this incredibly vital cultural revolution we're in would stop. It'd be better for me to say it because then it sounds worse. But I actually think this is enormously big and important. It would be a huge hindrance and would silence people and cause enormous pain.
And it legitimizes the critique too, doesn't it? We
Yeah.
won. The government said this is bad stuff, and the government represents the real moral imperative of the country. There's a horrible thought.
Right. But I think it would take more than that to, I mean, we're the ones that aren't going to stay on the farm at this point, and I think that's true for artists of color, for women, you know, who led so much of the movement towards new voices being heard from feminist art practice and stuff, and then to this explosion of lesbian and gay voices.
Well, and what's at risk also is the infrastructure within the arts community, that those connections among institutions and is being lost in the process of this defunding. But it's happening at the same time, just as these online services are emerging. So there is the potential for a paradigm shift, and that you know, there is comfort to be had in the fact that these structures are problematic. The NEA does have a lot of problems, and they recently cut the media arts off at the knees by taking all of its fellowship money away, which is going to be very difficult to recover from. But if we can find a way to recover from it over time, it may strengthen But you know, it's a difficult thing to put a temperature in, and pull out and find out just whether the patient's going to make it or not.
Yeah, what's imperative in any case is that we continue to put some effort to building physical structures of community for artists. And you know, because I think you're right, Tim. You know, ultimately there can't be the silencing of all these voices, and there are big paradigm shifts and cultural changes that are going to happen anyway. But individual lives can be wounded. A lot of people can be hurt. A lot of kids are never going to get touched by the art that they might have in rural Kentucky because of this. And a lot of people in the cities of LA are going to get broken by the effort to make a living, make art, make friends, make a life. And so I think it's important that that now, in the course of fighting for funding and for whatever comes after this battle, that we build infrastructures of support for art that's not the official line.
And with that, I'm deeply apologetic to have run out of time, but they only give us 60 minutes for this wonderful show. So I want to thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Tim. This was great. I want to thank you for being with us too, and I think you should go and do something about this. I think you should let your congresspeople know that you care about this. Often they count on your silence too. So you tell them, get used to it. See you next month.